You guys remember Aesop and his moral stories?
Oh, yes.
I know you can all see that. She's going to turn the dimmer lights down. But. So there are several stories in Aesop's fables that feature jackdaws and crows. The crow in the picture is probably the one we all know, where a thirsty crow, is that too dim? Too dim? No. Okay, we're good. The thirsty crow is actually in a desert. He comes across a pitcher, and his beak is too short to reach the water inside, so he devises a plan to drop stones into the water. So the moral from the story is necessity is the mother of invention, but it is really interesting that I should have looked up when did Aesop write the fables? It's like, I know, I was thinking 13 or 1400s. A long time ago.
No, before it was 400 or 600.
Oh, okay.
Before Christ.
Before Christ. So, I mean, we see all these stories, but, you know, we think, well, there's got to be grains of truth in all this. So way back then, they were noticing the intelligence of crows and ravens and other corvids. Because you probably didn't make that story up. You probably saw something like that happening. The other fable that, one of the many famous fables that involves a crow is The Crow and the Fox. You guys know this story? The Crow and the Fox. I remember this from when I was a kid. Because this story has been borrowed and reinvented by numerous storyteller, fairy teller people. So we often, in the more modern versions, the crow has a piece of cheese, but in the original Aesop, he had a piece of meat, probably from, carry on, dead animals. So the crow in this story is not as smart as in the other one. This is where we see his vulnerable side. The crow has a piece of meat, and he retired to a branch to eat it. The fox, wanting the food for himself, flatters the crow and calls it beautiful and wonders whether its voice is as sweet as its body. When the crow lets out a caw, the meat falls and is devoured by the fox. And the fox says, in modern poems, "My good sir, don't you know that every flatterer lives at the expense of those who take him seriously?" So this is a lesson, and he says, this is a lesson worth its price in meat, no doubt. Like, aren't you glad I just taught you this lesson? So the moral of the story is to never trust a flatterer, someone that's flattering you. Okay, just a couple, then we'll move on to ravens, but there are just pages and pages and pages of sayings, proverbs, or superstitions around crows. I don't know if you all can see those. Can you see those in the back? I wasn't planning to read them all to you. But some of my favorite ones that either are on my sheet here or on there, but I really like the one at the bottom that says, the Greeks used to say, "Go to the crows," as the same way that we would say, "Go to hell." And this whole bit about like how many crows, when, where, so it's unlucky to have a crow cross your path in Wales, but if two cross your path, the luck is reversed. But if you're in New England, if you come over the ocean and you're in New England, then it depends on which way they're flying. If two cross your path, you've got to be paying attention to whether they were flying to the left or the right. According to the Druids and people that are into supernatural magic stuff, if you look deeply into a crow's eye, you will find a gateway to the supernatural. Crow knows the unknowable mysteries of creation and is the keeper of all sacred law. Crow can bend the laws of the physical universe and shapeshift, being double, being in two places at once, and becoming the fly on the wall that observes what is happening from far away. I want to be the crow. All sacred texts and ancient records are kept under the protection of crow. Crow is also the omen of change. Okay, ravens. These birds are probably the most common bird symbol in mythologies, not just with the corvids, but of all birds out there. And Kim and I were just sort of talking about this. Why is that? Probably like much with us today, we find them so fascinating. They probably were around humans. People were noticing how intelligent they were. People, maybe even were communicating with them. There are stories of course, Native Americans and other people raising them as pets. So they are extremely common in legends and folklore and mythologies, but also in our modern cultures. I've said before, they assume a variety of roles, ranging from messenger and deities to sages and tricksters and even to the bringers of death. They play a central part in many Aboriginal creation myths, and like crows and other Corvids, they are typically associated with the supernatural realms lying beyond the ordinary experience. So wild ravens are very often associated with wisdom and prophecy, like we saw with magpies. They can also have a negative connotation, especially in our Christian Western cultures. In many Western traditions, ravens represented darkness, destruction, uncleanliness, and evil. They were often associated with deities of impurity and death. Witches and devils were said to be able to take the shape of ravens. Obviously, their color black certainly plays a part in these beliefs, but it's also because they ate carrion. They were often seen amongst the dead, especially on battlefields. They were often seen with wolves, and that's, symbolically, wolves were one of man's oldest enemies. So that's, we can kind of understand why people saw them that way. But before ravens became vilified throughout Europe and wherever Europeans went, they had a long history of myth and legend with numerous ancient cultures, particularly the Norse and Celtic regions. The ravens of European mythology invariably are messengers, or they take the shape of various deities and spirits, versus in the indigenous cultures of North America, ravens are often the deity. So versus in Western cultures, they represented or they were a symbol of the deity, but in Native American indigenous tribes, they were gods. So the most widely known heroes of European folklore that are associated with ravens are Bran, Morrigan, King Arthur, and Odin. I'm going to go over those four. So Bran was the Welsh giant. This was back in the day when there were giants. He comes in from Old Welsh Celtic mythology. He was called Bran the Blessed. His real name that I don't want to try to pronounce. You guys speak Gaelic? Bran Findegal. That means blessed raven. That actually translates to blessed raven. He was the king and protector of all of Britain at one time. He was a Welsh god, but he was the protector of all of Britain. He kept ravens. He was eventually mortally wounded. You think these giant gods are never going to die, but that's what makes those kinds of stories so fascinating, is that those gods were killed. He was mortally wounded while warring against the Irish, and he commanded his followers to behead him and bury his head in what is now underneath the Tower Hill in London. And that was because he wanted to protect Britain forever. So the popular superstition arose, declaring that if ravens ever fled the Tower of London, the monarchy would fall. And as long as they nested there, Britain would never be successfully invaded. Bran's ravens have been there for over 900 years. They are kept there today. This is a modern day picture, obviously. During World War II, Tower Hill was bombed and the ravens were lost. And it is said that Winston Churchill, knowing full well the ancient legends, ordered the immediate replacement of the ravens, and they were actually sent for in the old Bran's old land. So they didn't just go get any raven. They specifically went to the Welsh hills and the Scottish Highlands to get ravens so they could be authentic. Yeah, if you go, I've never been there, but if you go there, you'll see like this amazing array of buildings and cages and people. There are people that work full time simply to raise and care for these ravens. Among the Irish Celts, ravens are associated a great deal with the goddess Morrigan. She was frequently known as a triple goddess, and so she actually has, it was really 3 women, and I don't know their names, I can't remember them all, but she's often called the triple goddess, and she took the shape of a raven. So she was frequently flying around over battlefields, and she would choose the slain, and she would protect the warriors. This image here is Kuchulian, however you would say that. See, I put them on there so that you didn't have to just hear my butchery. So that guy, the second one there on the bottom, Kuchulian, he was a famous Celtic warrior, and she was frequently seen with him. So she was often called the battle crow. She was prone to prophecy and could often predict the outcome of battles. So he eventually was killed, and when he was, Morrigan came and perched on his shoulder. Could have very well happened that a raven showed up on a dead guy's shoulder. This is just some cool Celtic art. There's tons and tons, just like in our Native American art. There's lots of ravens and corvids in general in modern day and historic Celtic art. The dream of Roanby was written in the 14th century, but it was set back a few centuries earlier to the time of King Arthur. And the knight Owen had an army of ravens. And in this story that's called The Dream of Roanby, Owen was playing chess with King Arthur. And they were in Cornwall. Yeah, it's important that they were in Cornwall. King Arthur's men began harassing Owen's ravens, and Owen asked the king to leave his ravens alone. And King Arthur did nothing. He ignored the guy. And so Owen set his ravens on King Arthur's men. And the ravens killed a bunch of people. And then he turned to King Arthur, and the story goes, in this dream of Roanby, that he turned King Arthur into a raven. And we were saying that in some of the stories, he's turned into a, how do you say it? Coach?
Oh, a chuff? You mean a chuff? What do you think?
The other Corvid that's...
Chuff.
Chuff. Yeah. I'm like, looking right at you. What's it called?
Well, I don't
Chuff.
I said chuff.
Yeah. But those aren't nearly as, spectacular as the raven. So we don't have to say he's a raven. And so this still in modern times, or at least until 1900 or so, many people still believed that King Arthur took the form of a raven. And in Cornwall, especially, people will not kill a raven, just in case. This is one of the most interesting human-raven relationship stories. This is Odin. This was the great Norse god of the Vikings. Narratives regarding Odin are primarily from the 13th century, and are recorded in Iceland. He was known as the god of ravens. So this picture here is actually from an 18th century Icelandic manuscript. So as you can see, he has one eye open. He's got this huge sword. So this is how he's normally depicted, as one-eyed, long-bearded, frequently wielding a spear that had a name named Gungnir. Gungnir was his sword's name. And he is always wearing this giant cloak and a broad hat, and he's accompanied by his animal companions. In this picture, it only has the two ravens are perched on either shoulder. He normally has, and frequently in pictures, and I'll show you some more, has two wolves. So he had two wolves at his feet, Jerry and Frecky, and he had two ravens, Hungen and Munnin. Hungen and Munnin. Hungen translates to thought, and Munnin translates to memory. You can see those there, so you don't have to, if you want to write them down. So each daybreak, Odin sent them from him to fly around the world, delivering messages and gathering news and information to bring back to him. They were to observe what was happening, question people, and even talk to the dead. They would come back and whisper to Odin what they had seen and learned. And since they embodied his mind and thoughts, his memory and thoughts, they symbolized his ability to see into the future and likely helped create the concept that ravens are prophetic. Here's some more images of Odin with his wolves and ravens. Pretty cool. So the importance of ravens in Vikings is apparent, not just with him, but in how much the bird is used, was used in historical artifacts. It's very apparent in armor, helmets, shields, carvings on boats. Even today, a Viking festival in Scotland uses the image of a raven. So there were so many cool images on the web. And Alexander the Great was also supposedly guided across the desert by 2 ravens sent from heaven. So here's some raven sort of proverbs and sayings. You can read these, but yeah, if anyone wants to give their child their first drink from the skull of a raven, let me know how that works. This concept of tapping on the house, so it's reminiscent, that third bullet down, tapping on the 3 times on a window, is obviously sort of feels like Edgar Allan Poe's story. That was, he came tapping on Edgar Allan Poe's window. So he commonly appears as an oracle bird, bringing messages from the other world. In Poe's poem, the narrator asks the raven if he will ever be reunited with his beloved deceased Lenore. And the raven just stood there and brought no news except nevermore. This is actually one of my images. This is a photograph I took that I turned into an artistic depiction there that looks like a painting or a drawing. This was in the Confluence Gallery, had a show called the Mythology show recently. So I had it there and actually sold on the opening night. But my statement, because I started researching this a long time, I've been into this kind of stuff for a while. And so I wrote a statement then that said, Raven, for many Northwest Indian tribes, is a cultural hero. Depending on the myth or tribe, Raven can be both an enigmatic and benevolent transformer figure, a shapeshifter, who can travel back and forth, can be a mediator between the land of the living and the land of the dead, or even future unknown lands. Raven can assist people in shifting consciousness in varying realms. As such, Raven is a guide to the magical, the mystical, and the unknown, and is called the Keeper of Secrets.
It's beautiful, Mary.
So in addition to those roles of transformation, ravens and Native American folklore are most regularly the creators of the world, or they have a great role in that if they are not the creator. They are considered gods and deities, versus in Europe they were the animals or symbols of gods and deities. Details on the creation tale differ, but essentially Raven, sometimes a creature with a human body and a raven's beak, is believed to have made the world. He gave light to people, taught them to take care of themselves, make clothes, canoes, houses. He brought vegetation, animals, and other benefits for humankind. One story, Raven again assumes the role of Noah in the biblical Great Flood. He is said to have taken animals 2 by 2 on a big raft in order to save them. After all he had done for the humans, he wished to marry a woman in return, but the family refused to let her go. As a revenge, the raven created mosquitoes, crushed leaves, and sent them to pester humans forever. So now I'm going to show you a video. There are numerous legends around, as we saw from Dana's talk, we got a little sneak peek of it, on how Raven gave light to the world. These legends, stories vary slightly, but the general story is the same, and I found one I really liked from a Haida elder. So you just have to bear with me for a second. I'm going to pop over to the internets. And
was created, it was totally dark, and people had to live and work in the darkness. And the raven heard about a man that lived on the Mouse River that had in his possession some lights that he used for himself. This wealthy man had a daughter. The raven decided to try to figure out how he could get that light. He made himself small in the water and she drank it. When he got inside, then she became pregnant. And the grandfather truly loved the baby and allowed him a lot of freedom. He found the bags of lights that he wanted, and he began to cry. He cried and cried to the point where people began to get worried that he would be sick. And finally, the grandfather said, well, just let him have the smallest bag. He opened it up, and it had the stars in it. Pretty soon he began to cry for the next bag. And after everybody went to bed, he opened the bag, and out came the moon. And after a while, he began to cry for the last bag. And when nobody was watching, he turned into a raven, and he held the bag in his mouth and flew out. And he released the sun, and that gave daylight to all the people.
What's playing? There's more stories playing. Okay, stop. Go away. Let's get to see what's on the computer. So this, some of the creation stories, one in particular is called Raven at the Headwaters of the Nass. And this raven mask is, has the same name, Ravens at the Headwaters of the Nass. This is attributed to the Tlingit tribe, active in the late 18th and 19th, active in the late 18th and early 19th century. This is in the Seattle Art Museum, and there, if you look closely, they consider that its ears, there's humans crouching in the raven's ears. So creation myths continue with various stories about how Raven created the earth and or how he created the first people. Back to back, here's another really fun video. This again, Dana gave you a sneak peek into the clams. So this is called Raven and the First People. We're going to do that same thing.
There was a time before the first humans when water covered the earth. Over an endless expanse of sea flew Raven, bored and lonely, until finally the waters began to recede. Supernatural beings were already upon the first reefs to emerge.
This is from a BBC documentary. Obviously old.
The newly formed islands soon became home to many creatures, natural as well as supernatural. It was a time when anything was possible. Boundaries of earth, sky, and sea were made non-existent. All beings were able to pass from one domain to another through miraculous powers of transformation. Generous forests carpeted the land, providing shelter and food for many different animals. Birds filled the skies, whales and fish swam the seas. Raven, through cleverness, trickery, and even outright theft, traveled about changing things to his liking. He brought fresh water to the islands. He even stole the sun to provide light for the world. But now he was bored and restless. Things had become too settled. He craved mischief and set out for more adventure. After gorging himself on the beach at Naikun one day, he noticed a large shell half buried amongst the kelp, and unlike any others, strange sounds came from inside. Upon closer examination, he saw the shell was full of tiny creatures hiding in terror. Fortunately for these creatures, Raven was no longer hungry. So instead of shoveling them down his throat, he used his most tantalizing voice to coax them out into his new and wonderful world. They began to emerge. A few ran timidly back in, but eventually Raven persuaded them all to come out. He had discovered the first humans, the Haida. With Raven's help, the Haida and their descendants lived well on these generous islands. Great legends were born of both man and beast. They grew and prospered, skillfully falling into the rhythm of the seasons as nature had intended, never forgetting that they were just one small part of the immense circle of life. These islands of the Haida had truly become Haida Gwaii.
That image there is the one you saw in the video. This is at the University of British Columbia Museum of Anthropology. It was created by Bill Reed, who's a very well-known, famous Haida artist. So does everyone know Haida Gwaii? Haida? It's just off the coast here, north of Bellingham, called, you might know it as the Queen Charlotte Islands. So that's, these coast tribes are really amazing stories and art from them. This is a Haida mask. That's Raven. That's a raven. So we're getting close to the end here. So other stories that I'm sure you've come across are these trickster stories. And so the thinking is that Raven, the trickster stories are a little bit newer, is the thinking, and they kind of go back in time to when Raven was younger. So perhaps Raven was a little younger when he was the trickster, like Coyote, and sometimes devious, and but not always, cruel. Sometimes he was just the butt of his own jokes. He was often only interested in food and would go to great lengths to satisfy his appetite, like anyone read the potlatch article I gave you, where he tricked his cousin Crow out of his entire winter supply of food. What a terrible guy. So this Raven often would have you in fits of laughter while he distracted you from the fact that he was tricking you, and sometimes getting you to do something you didn't actually want to do. Some more cool art. I'll close by reading one more Raven story and letting you look at that cool image. Tell Eric where it's from. I don't know off the top of my head. So this is, well, maybe I shouldn't read this. It's 7:48. It's a great story. I'll read quickly, and we can share some thoughts. Raven is called Raven and the Man That Sits on the Tides. Long ago, the oceans had no tides and no shores and no shallows. Raven knew there was lots of food in the sea, oysters and clams and mussels and crabs, but how could he get them? He was lazy, and he preferred getting into mischief. And he wondered, if only there was a way to move the water out of my way, I could gather food from the sea. He knew nothing about the sea, but he knew the Fogman did. He would find the Fogman and ask him. He asked the sandpipers, and nobody knew. The flock darted and swooped around. He could not figure out which way they wanted him to go. He asked the gulls, and they seemed to be lost souls, endlessly searching for themselves. He asked the cormorants, perched like lonely sentinels on the offshore rocks, but they did not know where the Fogman was to be found. Finally, he decided to go far to the north, where the fog comes in. He searched until one day he saw an island bouncing from wave to wave, like a raft free of its moorings. On it was a wrinkled old man with a long, scraggly beard. When he saw the Raven coming, he snatched up his hat and pulled it over his head, and fog began pouring out from under his brim. The Raven swooped down and snatched off the hat. How do you throw a fog? Why, hey, why do you throw a fog in a friend's face? Oh, hey, Raven, give me that hat. I've got fog to make. Why do you make fog anyway? It's my job. It's what I do. I'm the fog man. Well, do you know how the sea came to be and how to move it away from the shore? I don't know. Go away. Give me my hat. The sun is getting way too warm. Do you know who I should ask? Go ask the man who sits on the tide. What is the tide? Why does he sit on it? Where do I find him? The fog man pleaded, give me my hat, please, and go where the sun sleeps. Raven laughed. I'll just take your hat. It's time we had a sunny day. Leaving the fog man cursing on the shore, Raven flew towards the setting sun. For many days, he pursued the sun and was just about to give up when he spotted a solitary rock with seabirds swooping around its head and shoulders. Raven was about to ask the birds when the crag yawned, and then it blinked. And what had looked like a rock was really a giant man sitting in the water. 3 times Raven asked him, have you seen the man who sits on the tide? No answer. He kept asking him. On the 4th, the giant roared, I am the man who sits on the tide. His breath blew the raven back several miles. Avoiding his mouth, the raven came back and shouted in his ear, do you know the secret of how to move the sea? I know many secrets, but I can't remember them. Well, maybe if you told me one, it would jog your memory. Go away. I can't remember any. Well, what is the tide, and why do you sit on it? It's my job. It's what I do. I am the man who sits on the tide. Curious, the raven tried to see what he was sitting on. Well, if you stood, no. I have always sat on the tide. It's what I do. Come on, get up, go. And they, no, go away, you're bothering me. Raven began circling him. Raven spotted an exposed portion of his backside and got an idea. Flying high in the sky, he pointed his sharp beak right at it and dropped like a hawk, jabbing the giant really good. With a mighty roar, the giant rose and howled, jumping around and holding his backside. With his wail, but his wail was drowned out by the sound of 100 waterfalls as the sea poured into a large hole where he had sat. The giant danced around in pain. The sea was almost gone, leaving sand and floundering fish as far as the eye could see. Finally, rubbing the tender spot, the giant sat back down, and as he did, the sea spurted up and refilled its former waterline. Raven knew Giant's secret, so that's what the tide is. Now, if we can just teach him some new habits. Raven perched on his shoulder, and with some persuasive trickery, he suggested, from now on, how about you take a little stretch twice a day? Just a short one, so people can gather food from the sea. No, I have been sitting here. I am the man who sits on the tide. Sitting is what I do. I have always done this. I always will. Come on, everybody needs a break now and then. Just a short stretch, twice a day. Go away. You're upsetting me. I know, it's my job. It's what I do. I'm the raven. I upset things. I upset the darkness when I stole the sun. I put it in the sky. I upset the cold when I stole the fire. I gave it to the people. Now I'm upsetting you twice a day. As Raven began circling for another jab, the giant roared, why can't I swat you like a mosquito? You are no bigger than me than a minnow. He began to swing his arms wildly at the raven. Giant waves were formed, and as the two struggled, Raven trying to jab the giant trying to crush the raven. A great storm struck the shores, and they say that this was when the mountain goat first tasted salt, and why seashells are found in the mountains. Trying as hard as he could, Raven could not get near a tender spot on the giant. Then Raven remembered Fogman's hat. Raven pulled the hat down over his head. Fog began pouring out, thicker and thicker. A fog bank enveloped the giant. He looked around and tried to spot Raven, but all he saw was fog. Then, yow! Raven jabbed him for good. For a little while, he jumped and danced, and then settled on his spot. But before he did, before the waters receded, Raven was able to gather food from the seashore. The waters were shallow enough for fish. There were oysters and clams and mussels and crabs. The sandpipers and gulls and cormorants found plenty to eat. And then as the raven settled back down, the waters returned to their former level. Raven began to visit the giant twice a day at different times to catch him by surprise. You don't need to install updates right now. supposed to happen on the Mac. Almost. As it came to surprise him twice a day, all by himself, without Raven's reminder. The giant would stand up. It's one day he saw, surprisingly saw that one day the Raven stood up all by himself, stretched and looked around, and after a bit he sat back down. Raven was puzzled. He disguised himself as a seabird and flew to the giant's shoulder. Why did you just stand up and sit down? It's my job. It's what I do. For as long as I can remember, it's what I've done. I am the man who makes the tide go in and out. And as the Raven flew off, relieved he would not have to upset the giant any longer, he laughed. I am the Raven. I upset things. It's my job. It's what I do. Okay, let's find a way to turn some lights on. Magic. Come on. Okay, now I have stolen all of your storytelling time, but if I know some of you have some things to share. Carl was the first one to ask me. Do you want me to try to, I might be able to
I
pass
was
this to you.
trying to tell Carl's lifestyle with the Corvids. When I was 4 years old, we lived up on the Rendezvous Road, Gun Ranch intersection, the old house that fell down 2 weeks ago.
Really? Oh, no.
Yeah, oh yes.
Oh, I didn't know.
Anyway, that spring, we had several hundred magpies flying around our house and barn and herd of cows. And they were accused of picking eyes out of the calves. So my father had a really good idea. He came to us and bought a bottle of strychnine and a bone with a little meat on it, and soaked it with the strychnine and tied it to the roof of the barn, which lasted for about a day and a half, and the magpies picked it so much they plucked it loose, and it fell on the ground, and my very favorite old puppy ate the strychnine and dried in my eyes, and I said, those magpies have a lot of trouble coming, because now that upsets me. So 2 years later, we moved to Beaver Creek in the old house up there, and I'm old enough now to be traveling around by myself, so I raided every magpie nest within about 20 miles of the old house at Beaver Creek, get the fledglings out, cut off the left wing, to bring to the mercantile, where they gave me a dime for every wing.
Oh, my God.
It was a dumb deal.
Yeah, they wanted rid of the magpies as bad as I did, so I helped them do it. And as far as the crows and ravens, the crows used to be thick here when everybody planted corn and chopped it into silage and spent all winter feeding it to our cows. And then, as far as the crow-raven thing, when it snowed here in the Methow, we never saw a piece of pavement again until spring, because there was always about that much ice on the roads, and we drove old cars that would do about 35 miles an hour and had a heater in it to make a hole like that big you could see through. So everybody drove very slowly. Now you come up this highway, and there's a big sign that says 60 miles an hour, and everybody thinks they should go 60 miles an hour because the sign says so. And they killed the deer that now the ravens are living on next to the roadways. And about Mr. Davis' sharp-tailed grouse, we had a lot of sharp-tailed grouse. My little brother and I would fish up the creek bottom to the Lester Road from Beaver Creek Road, or Blocky Hill Road, where Blocky Hill crosses. There's an old big house there. We lived in that house, and Claude and I had the run of the creek, and then came 48, and all there is left of Beaver Creek is a big pile of rocks. All the birch trees have gone to the Columbia, so the sharp-tailed grouse disappeared. I don't think through any woodcutters, because it's obviously cutting down a birch tree is sort of a waste of time. There's not much there. But your picture of the raven in the birch tree was beautiful.
Oh, which one was that?
The one that,
Your photo.
Oh, that was an aspen tree. Yeah,
that was a what?
it was an aspen. It was a burnt aspen from the road to Aspen Lake.
Huh? Looked like birch tree.
Yeah,
like a
no,
Texan.
it was, yeah, they were all those burnt aspens that are on Frost Road as you go up.
anyway, that's the story of the Corvids in the Methow as far as Carl's concerned.
That's great. So, have you changed your tune about them?
No. The only thing I like about them nowadays is they provide fledglings for the ravens to eat.
Did you guys ever see them actually poking out the eyes of calves while they were still alive?
I wasn't old enough to know that. I think that probably it would have been sick calves,
Sick calves.
or heifers that aren't good mothers that
Uh-huh.
went off and left their babies.
Jenny, this isn't going to go up to you. So.
Oh, I've seen them poking the eyes out of a live baby seal.
Oh, that's
That was-
terrible.
We just wanted to rescue that seal so bad. Ravens.
Ravens.
Raven. It was beautiful.
You have something, Eric?
Yeah, I don't need the mic. I particularly like to recommend this book that she brought, Ravens Inn by Ben Gadd. He's a longtime naturalist up in the Canadian Rockies, and it's a novel, but it's pretty authentic as far as raven lore is concerned, and it's just a fun read if you like to read about natural history.
It's like from the raven's point of view, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the raven is the speaker, that's
Yeah.
the voice.
Yeah.
It is a
I've
raven.
had this book forever, and I haven't read it, so it's next on my list.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. And the other thing I'd like to say is that if you haven't discovered A Murder of Crows, a documentary by our next speaker for the Maslow.
Oh.
It's a story of his research on crows at the University of Washington.
Yeah.
It's available on Netflix. And I turned mine in a week ago, so it should be available if you want to
Yeah.
look at it.
There's stuff like, and I think his lab has its own website, and so all that stuff I didn't put on. There's a gazillion videos out there from Maslow's work, so I didn't list them all. But you can go to they have a name for his lab, but it's in our notes, and you can click there, and you can just see tons of news pieces and PBS pieces. And, yeah. Roxy has something.
Oh, I don't think any of that. I was, a friend of mine, well, it's Sam Owen, and she lives up by the old game department house. And she has a lot of Clarks at her house this year that she has never had before, but she said the thing that just absolutely amazed them was the Clarks were attacking the smaller birds at the feeders and killing them and eating them. And she said it was the most bizarre behavior, and she asked me, because she knew we were coming to the class, if anybody had ever seen them do that before.
We should definitely ask the Clark's person.
Clark's nutcrackers at my feeder, and they just go through it.
Yeah.
Do it in about 2 days.
Yeah.
And she said it was just absolutely,
Like killing like chickadees and nuthatchers?
yeah, the little
Actually eat them.
and yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, we should do some research on whether that's been seen before. Jeez.
So that was very interesting.
They are, and corvids are known to be omnivores,
Yeah,
but
you don't usually think of cartoons killing.
yeah.
Even the sweet gray jays will kill baby birds.
Yeah.
Cats.
I wish they'd catch dogs.
Yeah, that was good. That and turkeys.
Stories and experiences. Do you want me to pull up the thing?
Yeah, if you could
If I
just
can
show
make
them,
sure
this
my
is,
computer's not.
so- my husband and I visited St. Lawrence Island in Alaska several years ago, and then went over to the mainland of Alaska. It was a just major birding trip. And when we were outside Nome, there are all these gold mining dredges, all these old dredges, these huge things. I have a shot of them. And on one of them, some ravens had made a nest. That's what the dredge looks like. And here's the big, go back to the other photo, Mary, if you could. Yeah, the thing sticking out on the left. On the very top of that is, next one.
Okay, but it's like this right here.
Yeah, right out there was the raven's nest. And there you can see the nest is pretty darn big. There's one of the parents standing up on top. and there were 4 babies in it, but they were really big babies. You could only see the 3 here, but there were 4, and then we got a very...
Let's see if I can make this bigger.
We got a very short video.
Okay.
And the parents, oh, because it's not.
Oh, that was it.
That was it.
Very
The
short.
parents, I mean, there were these huge 4 ravens in this nest, and the parents just kept going in and out and feeding them. And I just didn't see how they possibly were going to find enough food for these 4 giant raven chicks, and how the chicks could still be in the nest and still be being fed by the ravens. But,
Maybe they had other ravens that were no longer there.
that could be, I don't know. But I just thought it was a very interesting place for ravens to nest.
Well, I've seen that. It's I've driven from here to southern Utah 2 springs in a row, and if you've done that drive, there's a lot of desolate country if you take the back roads. And I've seen that exact thing where you've been driving for miles and there is absolutely nothing but some random scrub bushes here and there, and then all of a sudden there'll be some old piece of farm equipment or some kind of well or windmill, and there's a giant raven's nest in there.
Mary, could I add a little bit to that story I'm trying to tell?
Yeah.
You know, when I talked about we moved up there were 14 families making a living on the farms up there. And today there's only 3 farms, and they make only alfalfa. So the crows that had a lot of feed when I was a young man now don't have any. It's just the 3 farmers, and they don't make any corn or anything that the crows used to eat. They feed only alfalfa, and it's not as attractive.
Yeah.
And so we've got 3 people there making a living on what used to feed 14 families.
Yeah.
Changed world.
Has anyone, I know some of you have had your own sort of personal, quasi-spiritual, experience or relationship with a bird? Anyone?
I watched a crow in the southwest walk to the end of the branch, stand there, and literally hang on with one foot and flip over. Hang off the branch with one foot. It had to be play.
Yeah.
I mean, there was nothing. It had to be play. And he hung there as long as he could and then let go and fly away. It was amazing.
About 25 years ago, I figure, I visited Point Defiant Zoo and Aquarium in Tacoma with a friend of mine. And it was a rainy day, and it was like midweek or something, and there was hardly anybody there. And at that time, they had beluga whales. They don't anymore, but they had 2 beluga whales in a tank. And we were just sitting there watching for a while, and there was I don't really remember if it was 1 crow or 2 crows or however many crows, but there was definitely at least 1 crow walking around on the edge of the tank, like a concrete ledge, and it had a little sea urchin shell, and it was carrying the sea urchin shell around, and every once in a while it would like set it down and walk away, and then it would pick it up and walk around, and at some point it threw the sea urchin shell into the water. One of the beluga whales picked it up in the very tip of its mouth, swam around for a while, and then swam back and set it back down on the edge of the tank. And the 2 of them did this for as long as we stayed there. And I spent some time today looking up, interspecies play, and there's really nothing. So I have no way of confirming this except that I saw it. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, there's loads that I marked all these books because I thought I had to fill like 5 hours of time. but there's, these books have some really, I mean, like this one, The Gifts of the Crow, is Marsloff's most recent book, but it's not all scientific, it's fairly scientific, but there's some really cool stories in here. Again, we've been mentioning this one. If you've never read Mind of the Raven by Bern Heinrich, I highly suggest it. There's lots of listening to him go over the minutia of doing field research, but it's pretty fascinating. But midway through the book, he goes to Germany, he goes to these other countries where he basically starts asking around everywhere. I think he has emailed during some of this time, and some of it's like literally letters back and forth from people, trying to find people that have had relationships with ravens. In many cases, raised them from the time they were young. So there's these amazing stories in here about people who grew up with ravens, or one just started coming to their house because they started giving it trinkets. There's a girl in Seattle, you can find all this stuff online, a video of this girl in Seattle who started leaving a gift out for her neighborhood crow, and it's been years, and they still have this relationship where it brings her things, and she gives it things, and she has this treasure trove of every single thing the crow has ever brought to her, and they have a little space in their yard where they do this. Crow Planet is another Seattle author. This is a fairly recent book written in the last few years by Linda Haupt. So it's all urban stuff about crows and all, just what they'll do. So if you like that kind of story stuff and relationship stuff, you can take a look at any of these books and write down their titles. Most of these are my own personal books, but I would loan them out to you all. I have this one that Carl brought as well. I actually haven't read this, but Carl's reading it right now.
Finished it.
You just finished it?
Yeah.
So this was
great stuff.
This was Marsloff's first book that he wrote. Well, not his first book. His first real scientific book about crows. He had written other books. He worked with Bernd Heinrich. So when we are with him, you can ask him those, way back in the day when he was an early, I think still graduate student. He and his wife went to Vermont or Maine and worked with him in the winter. So he has books from back then. But this was his first real scientific one with Tony Angle, and I tried to get Tony to come here and talk as well.
So when did we get these books?
When did we get them?
Wasn't that a Conservancy program?
Marsloff spoke in December 2.5 years ago, 3.5 years ago.
That's funny.
Yeah, that was, if you've come to our December programs at the barn, you know how big they can be. His talk was on crows and ravens, and we had around 400 people in the barn for that talk. He didn't bring as much as grizzly bears and wolverines, and yeah, it was pretty amazing. Does anyone have any?
Yeah, that reminds me of a story my neighbor Jane Baird told me, which I've taken very lightly until I hear these stories tonight. She claimed she set her car keys down on the railing of the porch, and they were stolen and then returned by a raven.
Wow. Took a little spin in the car and then brought
I had a great sighting. It was last winter. And in the field next to us where there's some old apple trees, and of course there wasn't much snow last winter, there was a mama deer and a little baby deer, and the fawn was having, just standing there. Wasn't really doing much, not looking well. There was a whole flock of crows. There had to have been 20 crows in the trees up above. And there were these two large ravens. And I was watching them, and the ravens would go to the trees and grab some of the old apples, and they would come back, and they would drop the apples. Well, they found that the large deer was eating the apples, so one of them went down and distracted the bigger deer, and the other one actually dropped down and was feeding the fawn.
Wow.
It was amazing.
Huh.
It was one of those things that you couldn't even believe.
Carl doesn't believe it.
I thought you just
These
said
were
the
ravens,
cat.
but I wouldn't believe the magpies.
These were ravens. They weren't magpies. They were ravens. And I don't know why all the other crows were just sitting there watching. I thought maybe the fawn was dying.
It's a good show.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. It was fed well by the ravens. Anyway,
And the doe was like, huh? The crow, the magpie jumped off the garden.
Yeah, see, that's how the magpie beat the buffalo in the race. Any other stories you must tell? Okay, one more from Paul.
Well, is you sometimes see on programs on television, if you happen to do that anymore, they say based on a true story, like, what isn't based on a true story. But anyway, this is just a little piece, and it's by Richard Brodigan, who is a writer, novelist, poet, and so on from the hippie era of San Francisco. But this is titled Crows Eating a Truck Tire in the Dead of Winter. We left Pine Creek, Montana and headed down the road toward Bozeman to pick up a friend at the airport. He was flying in from Los Angeles, California. The snow was very deep, locking up the ground like a white jail, and the temperature was a permanent 13 below zero with a meat axe wind showing who was boss of the North Country. My friend was going to have quite a surprise when he landed. The expression on his face would be interesting to observe. The palm trees that he drove by on his way to Los Angeles International Airport only a few hours ago would instantly become a distant part of the past when he got out of that airplane. Those trees could have been in his childhood. Maybe he saw them when he was 6 years old. I was right, and we drove back to Pine Creek. The road was an icy sword cutting starkly through the country that wore winter like a suit of albino armor. We went around a bend in the road, and there were 6 huge crows, black as a blind man's dreams. The crows were eating a truck tire in the center of the road. They didn't move as we approached them. They didn't show any fear or a desire to let us pass. They just kept eating the truck tire. We drove around them. You've got some winter here, my friend said. L.A. gone, now only a ghost town in his mind. Those crows are hungry. So I don't know whether they digest tires or not, but I was thinking Carrie saw something like this.
Yeah. Well, I want to